One of the most powerful crime bosses in America spent nearly 30 years shuffling down public streets in a filthy bathrobe and slippers, mumbling to lampposts, pretending he had completely lost his mind. The whole thing was an act, and it kept him free while the proud, honorable mob you know from the movies quietly fell apart in real life. The Godfather taught the entire world that these men lived by a code: loyalty, silence, family above everything, a line they would never, ever cross. It is one of the most beautiful stories ever put on screen. It is also one of the most dishonest. The real Mafia betrayed itself from the lowest soldier all the way to the boss of bosses. It dealt in the exact business it claimed to be above, and it crossed every single line it pretended was sacred, including the last one anyone thought was safe. Across 10 true stories, 2 countries, and decades of records, this is everything The Godfather quietly refused to show you.
Section 1. The code that was never really unbreakable. In The Godfather, the most powerful rule is the one nobody says out loud. You keep quiet. You never go to the police. You never tell outsiders what happens inside the family. There is even a word for it, omerta, and the movie treats it almost like a religion. Men go to prison, lose everything, and still say nothing. The film wants you to believe this rule is the glue that holds the whole world together, and that a true man of honor would rather suffer than break it. The real story is far less romantic. The rule did break, and the first time it broke in public, it happened on live television in front of millions of ordinary families watching at home. His name was Joseph Valachi. He was not a boss. He was a low-level soldier in the Genovese family in New York, the kind of man the films usually leave standing in the background. He was born in 1904 into a poor Italian immigrant family in East Harlem, and he spent most of his life inside the world the movies later turned into legend. By the early 1960s, Valachi was in prison. While he was locked up, he became convinced that his own boss, Vito Genovese, had marked him to be taken out. He believed the order had already gone out, and that someone on the inside would finish the job. Living in that kind of fear, he made a terrible mistake. He attacked another prisoner, mistaking him for the man sent to get him. He had the wrong person, and the prisoner did not survive. Valachi was handed a life sentence for it. Now he was trapped twice over. He was facing the rest of his life behind bars, and he still believed his old organization wanted him gone. So he made the choice that no made man was ever supposed to make. He decided to talk. In October 1963, Valachi sat in front of a United States Senate committee led by Senator John L. McClellan. The hearings were filmed and shown across the country. People crowded around their televisions to watch, and there, on camera, Valachi did something that had never been done before by anyone on the inside. He admitted out loud that the secret criminal organization was real. Up until that moment, this was still an open question. The public had heard rumors for years. Police had their suspicions, but there was no hard proof from a member who had actually lived it. The head of the FBI had spent a long time playing down the idea of a national crime network. Valachi tore that down in a single set of hearings. He even gave it a name the whole country would remember. He called it Cosa Nostra, which roughly means our thing. Then he explained how it was built, from the boss at the very top, down through the underboss, the advisor, the captains, and the soldiers like himself. He described the ruling council that settled arguments between the families. He walked through the private ceremony used to bring in a new member. He named names. He laid out the rules. He told the country how the machine actually ran. None of this looked anything like the movie. There was no calm dignity in that room. There was a frightened man,
already serving a life sentence, talking to save himself, giving up every secret he knew because the people he had trusted had turned on him first. The thing the films hold up as sacred, Valachi treated as a trap he was desperate to escape. His words did not send many bosses to prison right away. He was a soldier, not a leader, and a lot of what he knew was hard to prove in a courtroom. But the damage landed in a different way. He proved to the public and to the government that the organization was real, organized, and stretched across the country. He handed investigators a clear map of who was who.
And the wave of attention his story created pushed lawmakers toward tougher tools that would later be used to take the entire system apart, piece by piece. Think about what The Godfather is actually built on. The emotional weight of the whole film depends on the belief that these men live and die by a code, that loyalty comes before everything, that you simply do not talk. Valachi is living proof that the code had a breaking point, and that breaking point was fear. The moment a man believed his own side was coming for him, the rule that was supposed to be unbreakable bent in about as long as it takes to feel afraid. Valachi spent the rest of his days behind bars and passed away in 1971. Nobody threw him a celebration. To the old world he came from, he had become the lowest thing a person could be. But here is the part that matters. He was not some strange exception. He was the very first crack in a wall the films pretend can never crack at all. Once one man proved the wall could break, others started to wonder why they were the only ones still keeping quiet. Valachi was a foot soldier, low on the ladder, easy for the old bosses to wave away as a scared nobody. They told themselves the men at the top were made of something stronger, that real power came with real loyalty. They were wrong about that, too. The next time the code broke, it would not be a frightened soldier doing the talking. It would be one of the most feared second-in-command figures in all of New York. And the man he handed over to the government was the most famous boss in America. Section 2. When the second-in-command turned on the king. The old bosses had a comfortable excuse after Joseph Valachi. He was only a soldier, they said, a nobody who got scared. Real loyalty, the kind that mattered, lived higher up the ladder, with the men who had truly earned their place. Then came someone who proved that excuse was hollow. His name was Salvatore Gravano, and most people knew him as Sammy the Bull. Gravano was no background figure. He was the underboss of the Gambino family, the second most powerful seat in what was then the most famous crime organization in New York. He carried a fearsome reputation. He was the kind of man other tough men were careful around. By his own account, he had been involved in 19 hits over the years. If The Godfather wanted to show you a real version of the loyal, dangerous, trusted right hand, Gravano was about as close as real life ever got. To understand why his story matters so much, you need to know the man he served. In December 1985, outside a steakhouse in Manhattan, the boss of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, was taken out in the street along with his driver. The order came from a rising captain named John Gotti, who was sitting in a car nearby, watching it happen. Gravano was right there beside him. Part of the reason for the move was simple survival. Castellano was about to learn that Gotti's crew was deep in the illegal product trade, something he had forbidden, and Gotti's protector inside the family had just passed away from illness. With Castellano gone, Gotti took over. Gotti quickly became the most famous mobster in the country. The newspapers called him the Dapper Don for his expensive suits, and then the Teflon Don, because nothing the government threw at him would stick. He beat 3 separate court cases. He smiled for the cameras. He acted untouchable.
and for a while he genuinely was. By 1990, the law had finally built a serious case, and both Gotti and Gravano were arrested together. While they waited, the FBI played its strongest card. Agents had secret recordings of Gotti talking, and on those recordings, the boss was running his own underboss down behind his back, blaming Gravano for problems and talking about him like a tool to be tossed aside. Gravano heard those recordings.
The loyalty he believed he was part of, the brotherhood the films treat as something holy, turned out to be one way only. So in 1992, the most feared underboss in New York walked into a courtroom and did the one thing he had sworn never to do. He sat down as a witness for the government and testified against his own boss. He talked for about 9 days. He laid out the inner workings of the family in plain detail. He admitted his own part in 19 hits, and he was careful about how he put it. He had not personally carried out all 19 himself. He had been involved in them, sometimes as the planner, sometimes as the one who did the job. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Among the people he had helped remove were his own best friend and his own brother-in-law. He built his confession around the very kind of people the films swear a man of honor would give his life to protect. It worked. Gotti, the boss who supposedly could not be touched, was found guilty and sentenced to life. He never walked free again and passed away in prison in 2002. Gravano, in exchange for his cooperation, received a 5-year sentence and was placed into witness protection. Sit with that trade for a moment. A man involved in 19 hits served roughly 5 years because the information inside his head was worth more to the government than any single case. There was no quiet honor in it anywhere. There was a deal, plain and simple. This is the part The Godfather can never show you, because the whole film leans on the belief that the men at the top are made of something finer. Michael Corleone suffers, loses people he loves, and carries it all in silence. The real second-in-command of the most famous family in America did the exact opposite. The instant he understood that his boss did not value him, the bond snapped like cheap thread, and he handed the entire organization to the people who had been chasing it for decades. The story did not even end with some wise old figure fading quietly into retirement. After his time was served, Gravano left witness protection and went to live out in the open in Arizona under a new name. He gave interviews. He taunted his old world on camera, practically daring them to come after him. Then he was arrested all over again, this time for running a large operation moving illegal product, the very trade the films love to pretend these families stayed far above. The man who broke the code did not turn into a philosopher. He went straight back into the business. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By now, the old guard had watched a soldier talk and a feared underboss talk, but they still clung to one last comfort. A boss, they told themselves. A real boss who had clawed his way to the very top would never sit in a witness chair and give it all away. That belief was about to shatter too. It would be broken by the only New York boss who managed to stay free while every other family head sat behind bars. A man who was about to make a choice that nobody in the entire history of the American mob had ever made. Section 3. The Boss Who Wore a Wire. The men at the very top had one last story they told themselves. A soldier might crack, even an underboss might crack. But a boss, a man who had fought his way to the head of a family and held that power for years, would carry his secrets all the way to the end. That was the final pillar holding up the whole idea of honor. And in 2004, a man named Joseph Massino knocked it flat. Massino was the boss of the Bonanno family, one of the 5 families of New York. He was born in Queens in 1943, and he was sharp, careful, and patient in a way most of his rivals never managed. Through the 1990s, he earned a nickname that tells you everything about where the mob was heading. They called him the Last Don. He earned it for a grim reason. By that point, the bosses of every other New York family were sitting in prison. Messino was the only head of a family still walking around free. He stayed free because he was obsessed with caution. He avoided phones for business. He kept his inner circle small. He had watched the government pull other families apart, and he was determined not to hand them the same opening. For a long stretch, it worked. While the rest of the mob crumbled around him, Messino held on. But his own past was sitting there, waiting for him. Years earlier, in 1981, the Bonanno family had torn itself apart in an internal power struggle. 3 rival captains inside the family were invited to a meeting and taken out in a single coordinated move so that Messino's side could grab control. For decades, those 3 men were simply gone. Nobody on the outside knew where they had ended up. By the early 2000s, the FBI had built its case, and it got help from the last people Messino expected. His own brother-in-law, Salvatore Vitale, who had served as his underboss, was arrested and decided to cooperate. Vitale knew almost everything, and he told the government all of it. With his help and the help of other men who flipped, the case against Messino came together. In July 2004, Joseph Messino was found guilty of running a long list of crimes, including several hits. He was one of the most senior bosses the government had ever brought down. Then came the moment that made history. Messino was now facing a fresh charge, serious enough to carry the harshest penalty the law allows, the kind there is no coming back from. Staring straight at that, the Last Don made a decision no sitting boss of a New York family had ever made. He agreed to cooperate. He became a witness against his own world. He gave them an enormous amount. Acting on Messino's information, investigators went to a vacant lot in Queens, a place the mob had darkly nicknamed the Hole, and recovered the remains of the captains who had vanished back in 1981. That alone solved a mystery that had been cold for more than 20 years. But he went much further than anyone expected. While he was in custody, Messino agreed to carry a recording device. He sat down with the man running the family in his absence, an acting boss named Vincent Basciano, and he secretly recorded him. On that recording, Basciano laid out a plan to have a federal prosecutor taken out. The boss of the Bonanno family had turned himself into a living, breathing listening device for the FBI. Picture how impossible this would be inside the world of The Godfather. The entire weight of those films rests on the belief that the head of a family is the keeper of the code. The one man who would never break, no matter what. Vito Corleone is calm and silent. Michael turns himself into cold stone rather than betray his own. The real version, the actual head of a real New York family, sat in a small room and quietly handed the government everything he had, then put on a wire and went back in to get more. And the reward for breaking the most sacred rule of them all? It was huge. Messino had been handed 2 life sentences. He had been part of a long string of removals across his career. Yet because his cooperation turned out to be so valuable, a judge eventually sentenced him to the time he had already served. The most powerful boss ever to turn on the organization walked out the door. A man who had once ordered people to disappear got to go free, because the truth inside his head was worth more to the government than keeping him locked away. Put the 3 of them side by side, and the picture is impossible to miss. A soldier talked, an underboss talked, and finally, a sitting boss not only talked, he wore a wire against the man who replaced him. The unbreakable code, the loyalty that the Godfather treats as the very soul of these men, snapped at every single rung of the ladder, top to bottom,
until there was almost nothing left of it. But loyalty is not the only thing the films get wrong, and they do not get it wrong by accident. There is another promise built right into The Godfather, one the whole plot actually turns on. These families, the movie insists, had lines they refused to cross, and the deepest line of all was the product trade, something they considered beneath them. That may be the single biggest fantasy in the entire story, and the truth behind it quietly poured more illegal product into America than almost anyone at the time understood.
Section 4. The business they swore they were above. The whole story of The Godfather starts with a refusal. A man named Salazzo comes to Vito Corleone with an offer. He wants money and political protection for a large operation moving illegal product. Vito listens, and then he says no. He calls it a dirty business, the kind of thing that will cost the family its friends in high places and stain everything they have built. That single no is the spark for everything that follows. It gets Vito targeted. It drags his sons into a long and dangerous fight. And it plants an idea in the viewer that never quite goes away. These men, the film whispers, had standards. There were certain things they simply would not do, even for a fortune. The real families did not have that line. They were not pulled into the product trade against their will. They built it, ran it, and grew rich from it. And one operation laid bare just how deep it went. It became known as the Pizza Connection, and it is one of the clearest windows we have into how the real mob actually made its money. The name almost sounds like a joke because it sounds so harmless, but behind it sat one of the largest pipelines of illegal product the country had ever seen. Here is how the operation worked. Raw material was bought from suppliers overseas in places like Turkey and Southwest Asia. It was shipped to Sicily, where it was processed into a finished product. From there, it was smuggled into the United States. And then, instead of moving it through dark back alleys, the mob hid it in plain sight. They pushed it out through ordinary pizza shops and other small businesses they quietly controlled, spread across the country from New York all the way out to Illinois and Wisconsin. A person could walk past one of those places 100 times and never once guess what was really being handled in the back. The scale is hard to even picture.
Investigators later estimated that between 1975 and 1984, roughly $1.5 billion worth of product was funneled into America through this single network. That is not a little side hustle for a few crews. That is an international business. With profits so large, the mob had to run the money through banks and investment firms just to hide where it had come from. On the American side, much of it flowed through a man named Salvatore Catalano, a captain in the Bonanno family who, on paper, was simply the owner of a bakery in Queens. He led a tight group of Sicilian-born members the mob called the Zips. On the Sicilian side stood a powerful boss named Gaetano Badalamenti, who helped steer the flow of product toward his American partners. These were not background figures being shoved into something shameful. They were the people who built it. The case even came with a guide, a Sicilian insider named Tommaso Buscetta, who had turned against his old organization, took the stand to explain to the jury how this hidden world truly worked, the rules, the ranks, and the reach of it. He had not been part of the pizza scheme himself. He was there to translate it, to make a secret machine finally make sense to ordinary people sitting in a courtroom. When the government finally moved, the case became enormous. The trial began in 1985 with 22 defendants. It stretched on for about 17 months, which made it the longest criminal jury trial in American history up to that point. The pile of evidence was staggering, built on years of recorded conversations and surveillance. In the end, 18 people were convicted. Catalano and Badalamenti were each handed 45-year sentences.
And here is a detail that cuts straight against the gentle image the films sell. The world of this operation was not held together by quiet honor. While the trial itself was going on, one of the defendants was taken out, and another was attacked and barely pulled through. These were people who settled their own disputes in the middle of a federal prosecution. Now set that next to The Godfather. The movie wants you to believe Vito Corleone turned down the product trade on principle, that he was a man of values trapped in a corrupt world. The real families did not lose any sleep over whether to get involved. They turned the product trade into a machine that reached across whole continents, and they ran it through the most normal, friendly-looking businesses they could find. The corner pizza place was not a symbol of the honest immigrant dream. For this network, it was a counter. It is worth understanding why the film leans on that refusal so hard. A boss who says no to the product trade feels noble. He feels like a throwback to some older, cleaner kind of criminal, the type who only ever hurt other criminals. It makes the audience comfortable enough to quietly root for him. The truth that these same families were pouring enormous amounts of product into ordinary neighborhoods and wrecking ordinary lives would have made Vito very hard to love. So the story hands him a line he would not cross, even though the men he was based on stepped over it without a flicker of doubt. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So loyalty was a myth, and the clean hands were a myth too. But maybe the most stubborn image of all is the one the films sell with every slow camera push and every quiet, shadowy room. The picture of dignified, untouchable men, careful and disciplined, masters of secrecy who never put a foot wrong. There is one single afternoon in upstate New York that takes that picture apart completely. And it ends with some of the most powerful bosses in the country sprinting through the woods and losing their shoes in the mud. Section 5. The afternoon the secret empire tripped over its own feet. The films love to show these men as untouchable. They glide through quiet rooms in perfect suits. They speak in low, calm voices. They keep their world so well hidden that outsiders can barely prove it exists at all. Discipline, caution, and total secrecy are supposed to be the entire point. A real man of this world, the movies suggest, never slips, never panics, and never lets the curtain drop. Then you look at what actually happened on one single afternoon in 1957, and the whole image collapses in the most embarrassing way you can imagine. On November 14th, 1957, around 100 of the most powerful crime figures in the country gathered at a private estate in a tiny town called Appalachian in upstate New York. This was no small local get-together. Bosses, their advisors, and their bodyguards traveled in from all across the United States. The host was a man named Joseph Barbara, and the meeting was meant to settle some very big questions. The mob had just been through a major shakeup at the top after one of its most feared bosses, Albert Anastasia, was removed. Powerful figures like Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino needed to lock down who controlled what and confirm the new balance of power. In other words, this was supposed to be the secret summit of the entire national organization. The single most important room in the American underworld, packed with the people the films treat as legends. If the secrecy myth were even half true, this is exactly the kind of meeting that should have slipped quietly into history, with nobody on the outside ever knowing it happened. It did not slip away, and the reason was one local police officer. A state trooper named Edgar Croswell had been keeping an eye on Barbara for a long while. When expensive cars carrying license plates from all over the country suddenly started rolling into this sleepy little town, Croswell noticed right away. He began writing down the plate numbers. He ran them. One after another, they came back tied to known criminals. So Croswell did something very simple. He called for backup and set up roadblocks on the roads leading away from the estate.
What happened next is almost hard to believe. The moment word spread that police were outside, the most feared men in America did not calmly take charge of the situation. They panicked.
Some jumped into their cars and tried to drive off, only to be stopped cold at the roadblocks. Others did something far less dignified. They ran. Grown men in tailored suits and fine shoes bolted out the back and straight into the surrounding fields and woods, scrambling through mud and brush to get away. Some lost their shoes in the muck. Some crouched in ditches. These were the untouchable bosses the films practically build statues to, and on that afternoon, they were stumbling through the countryside like kids running from an angry neighbor. By the time it was over, around 60 of them had been rounded up. And when police asked these powerful men why so many of them had traveled hundreds of miles to one house on the very same day, the answers were almost comical. Some said they had come to visit a sick friend. Others claimed they had only stopped by for a barbecue or to grab a quick coffee. A house full of the nation's top crime bosses, and the best story they could agree on was that they all happened to want the same cup of coffee on the same day in the same tiny town. In a strange twist, the law could not make most of it stick. Many of the men were released within days because simply attending a gathering is not by itself a crime. Some were charged, but nearly all of those charges were later thrown out on appeal. On paper, the mob almost walked away clean. The real damage, though, had nothing to do with any courtroom. For years, the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, had played down the idea that there was any single organized national crime network at all. He treated it almost like a fairy tale. Appalachian made that position impossible to keep. You cannot keep telling the public there is no national organization when 60 of its leaders just got caught fleeing one house together. The raid forced the FBI to finally admit the truth and to start treating these scattered families as one connected enemy. It sparked congressional hearings and a fresh, focused push from law enforcement. The disaster at Appalachian helped set in motion the very pressure that would one day tear the whole thing apart. This is exactly what The Godfather can never afford to show you. The films sell secrecy and iron control as the very heart of these men. The reality is that their grandest, most secret meeting was undone by one small-town trooper who paid attention to license plates. And it ended with bosses sprinting through fields and lying to officers about coffee. There was no untouchable shadow empire that day. There was a crowd of men who got caught, got scared, and gave themselves away. And here is the part that should trouble anyone who still believes in the idea of the impenetrable secret society. Appalachian only proved that outsiders could see the organization from the outside, like watching a house through a window. The bigger blow was still on its way, because in the years that followed, the government would try something far bolder than sitting at a roadblock. They would take one ordinary man, give him a fake name and a fake life, and slip him all the way inside one of the families, where he would live as one of them, eat with them, and earn their trust for years. Section 6. The stranger who walked in and was almost made family. In The Godfather, family is everything, and the word means exactly what it sounds like. You are born into this world, or you are carefully brought in through blood and trust. An outsider cannot simply walk up and join. The whole idea rests on the belief that these men know one another, vouch for one another, and would spot a fake in a heartbeat. Trust is the wall that keeps the family safe. So here is a true story that should not have been possible. A man with a made-up name and a made-up life walked in off the street, and the family welcomed him as one of their own for nearly 6 years. His real name was Joseph Pistone. He was an agent with the FBI. He was born in 1939. He spoke Italian, and he understood the customs and the tiny everyday details of this world well enough to blend right in. In 1976, the FBI handed him a new identity. He became a small-time jewel thief named Donnie Brasco. Then he stepped out of his old life and vanished into the underworld, alone, with no badge, no partner at his side, and no easy way back out. He did not rush a single thing. He hung around the right bars and the right restaurants. He talked the talk. He slowly built a name for himself as a sharp, reliable guy who knew his business. Over time, he caught the eye of a Bonanno family soldier named Benjamin Ruggiero, a man everyone called Lefty. Lefty took him under his wing, taught him the ropes, and vouched for him. Later, Donnie grew close to a captain named Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black. These were not careless men. They were seasoned members of one of the 5 families, and they trusted him completely. This is where the secret society myth quietly falls apart. Donnie did not just linger on the edges. He was pulled deeper and deeper inside, treated like one of the crew, handed real business. By 1981, the family was getting ready to make him a full member, the highest honor their world can give, the ceremony of total trust. To earn it, he was expected to prove himself by carrying out a serious job against a target. The FBI looked at how far things had gone and saw the danger clearly. Their man was about to either cross a line he could not cross or be placed in a spot that could cost him his life. So in the summer of 1981, after nearly 6 years undercover, they pulled him out. Then the FBI did something that landed like a thunderbolt inside the underworld. They told the mob the truth. The man they had trusted, the guy Lefty had personally vouched for, the friend Sonny Black had welcomed into the fold, had been a federal agent the entire time. Every conversation, every deal, every secret spoken in front of Donnie Brasco had gone straight to the government. The evidence Pistone gathered was massive. It led to more than 200 people being charged and over 100 convictions. But the cost inside the family was severe in a very different way. Sonny Black, the captain who had brought Donnie in, was blamed for the whole disaster, and he was taken out by his own people. The message they left behind was deliberately grim, a punishment aimed at the very hands that had shaken the agent's hand and pulled him into the family. Lefty, the soldier who had vouched for him, was marked too. Before his own people could reach him, the FBI arrested him, partly just to keep him alive. The mob also placed a price of $500,000 on Pistone's head. Humiliated, the other families even forced the Bonannos out of their ruling council for letting it happen at all. Now, set this beside The Godfather. The films treat the family as a fortress built on blood, loyalty, and the razor instincts of men who can read a room and smell a liar from across it. The reality is that one outsider with an invented name fooled experienced, dangerous members of one of the most famous families in the country, not for a night, not for a month, but for years. He sat at their tables, he learned their secrets, he was nearly handed full membership. The wall of trust the films treat as unbreakable had a gap in it wide enough for a single determined agent to stroll straight through. And think hard about what that says about the men who got fooled. Lefty was no fool. Sonny Black was no pushover. They were hardened people who had lasted a long time in a dangerous business. They believed in the very same code the films celebrate, the same gut instincts, the same brotherhood. And it still was not enough to save them. The trust that was supposed to protect them turned out to be the exact thing that let the agent in. The more tightly they pulled him toward the center, the more damage he was able to do. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the secret was not safe, and the wall of trust was not real. But at least, you might think, the bosses themselves carried a certain dignity. Powerful, commanding, in full control of every room they walked into.
That is the image the films sell harder than almost any other.
So it is worth meeting one of the most powerful bosses in the entire country. A man who ran his family for years while shuffling down public streets in a tattered bathrobe and slippers, mumbling to himself, working very hard to convince the whole world that he had completely lost his mind. Section 7. The most powerful boss in America wore a bathrobe. The films sell you one picture of a boss above all others. He sits in a quiet study. He speaks softly, and the whole room leans in to listen. He carries himself with weight and calm. A man who commands respect just by walking through a door. Vito Corleone is the perfect version of it. Dignity is his armor. The idea baked into all of it is that real power looks powerful. That the man at the top of this world would never let anyone see him as weak or foolish or small. Then you meet Vincent Gigante, and that whole idea turns completely inside out. Gigante was born in New York in 1928. As a young man, he was a boxer. He came up inside the Genovese family, one of the 5 families, and he rose fast. Early in his career, he was the man sent to take out a powerful boss named Frank Costello. The attempt failed, and Costello survived, but it marked Gigante as a serious and dangerous figure. Over the years, he climbed all the way to the top. By the early 1990s, after John Gotti was finally sent away, Gigante was widely seen as the single most powerful boss in the entire country. And here is how the most powerful boss in America chose to protect himself. Instead of projecting strength, he projected madness. For nearly 30 years, Gigante pretended to be mentally ill. He shuffled around the streets of Greenwich Village in a ragged bathrobe and slippers, unshaven, mumbling to himself, looking for all the world like a confused old man who had lost touch with reality. He would drift into the road, talk to no one in particular, and act as if he barely understood where he was. People in the neighborhood grew so used to the sight that the newspapers handed him a nickname. They called him the Oddfather. None of it was real. Behind the bathrobe was a sharp, careful man running one of the most powerful crime families in the country. The entire performance served one purpose. Every time the law tried to put him on trial, his lawyers brought in doctors who declared he was too ill to understand the charges against him. Again and again, he was ruled unfit, and the cases stalled out. He turned looking helpless into a shield, and for a remarkably long stretch, that shield held. His caution ran even deeper. He was obsessed with never being recorded or overheard. He avoided phones. He did not even like people saying his name out loud. To point him out, his men would simply touch their chin instead of speaking. He ran his business out of a small club in the neighborhood, giving orders quietly while the rest of the world saw nothing but a babbling old man in slippers. Investigators who watched him in private told a very different story. When Gigante thought no official eyes were on him, the confusion vanished, and he gave clear, calm, sharp commands. Sit with how strange this is next to the films. The Godfather tells you that a boss survives by being respected, by being feared, by carrying himself like royalty. Gigante survived by doing the exact opposite. He made himself look pathetic on purpose. He let strangers pity him. He let people whisper that the poor old man had finally lost his mind. The flashier bosses, the ones who dressed sharp and smiled for the cameras and acted like characters out of a movie, ended up behind bars. Gigante, the man in the filthy bathrobe, stayed free far longer, precisely because he refused to look the part. But the act could not run forever. The government kept building, kept watching, and kept gathering proof that the confused old man was actually in full command of his family. By 1997, the courts had heard enough. A judge ruled that Gigante was perfectly competent to stand trial. He was convicted of racketeering and of plotting against others, and he was sentenced to 12 years. The court was blunt about what it had seen. It found that his mental illness had been faked, put on deliberately to dodge justice. Even from a prison cell, he reportedly kept his grip on the family for years afterward. And then came the final admission. In 2003, after almost 3 decades of public performance, Vincent Gigante stood in a courtroom and admitted the truth. The madness had been an act the entire time. The shuffling, the mumbling, the bathrobe, all of it had been theater, staged to keep him out of a cell. He had fooled doctors, juries, and reporters for years on end. He passed away behind bars in 2005. Picture this, honestly, for a moment. One of the most powerful men in the American underworld spent decades pretending to lose control of himself in public and chat with lampposts, all to stay out of a courtroom. There is no quiet dignity in that. There is no calm man in a study commanding the room. There is a frightened, brilliant performer who understood that looking powerful gets you caught, and looking broken keeps you free. The films could never show you this because it shatters the fantasy. A man in a bathrobe begging the world to believe he is crazy is not a king. He is someone running scared from the law and dressing the fear up as a costume. But here is the question worth sitting with. Why did the most powerful boss in the country feel he needed a disguise that desperate in the first place? Because by then, the government had finally found a tool that did not care how tough a boss was or how clever his act might be. It was a law built to take down an entire organization at once, leaders and all, and it was about to drag the heads of every major family in New York into the same courtroom on the very same day. Section 8. The law that put every boss in one room. The films leave you with a quiet feeling that this world is permanent. The Corleones rise, expand, move across the country, reach into business and politics, and the only thing that ever truly threatens them is each other. Betrayal from the inside, a brother who turns, a rival family. The law is almost a background detail, something to be paid off or stepped around. The story never shows the government simply walking in and taking the whole thing apart. The empire feels too big, too deep, too protected to fall that way. In real life, it fell in exactly that way, and it happened because of a single law. The law was called RICO. It was passed back in 1970, but for almost 10 years, nobody really knew how to use it. Prosecutors had this powerful tool sitting in a drawer and could not figure out how to make it work. The first real test came in 1980, when a Genovese boss named Frank Thierry became the first mob leader ever convicted simply for being the head of a criminal operation. After that, prosecutors knew exactly what they were holding. Here is what made RICO so dangerous to the mob. Before it, the law mostly chased individuals for individual crimes. You had to catch a specific man doing a specific thing. RICO flipped that completely. It let prosecutors go after an entire organization all at once. If you were the boss of a group that committed crimes, you could be held responsible for those crimes even if you never personally lifted a finger. Being the leader of the operation was now part of the case against you. And the penalties were enormous, with long sentences and the loss of everything you owned stacked on top. Think about what that meant. The very thing the films celebrate, the structure, the ranks, the chain of command from boss down to soldier, became the trap. The pyramid that gave these men their power was now the exact thing that could put them away. Their organization was no longer just how they ran their business. It was the evidence. At the top of the New York mob sat something called the Commission.
It was the ruling council made up of the bosses of the five families. When there was a dispute to settle or a big decision to make, the commission handled it. For years, it ran like a secret board of directors for the whole underworld, and proving it even existed had been nearly impossible. In 1985, a federal prosecutor named Rudolph Giuliani decided to aim RICO straight at that council. Instead of chasing one boss at a time, he charged the leadership of the five families together in a single sweeping case.
The charges covered the full menu of how the mob actually operated, including extortion, rigging entire industries, and ordering people taken out. The evidence leaned heavily on years of secret recordings, including tapes of mob figures squeezing money out of construction companies. One piece of the case shows just how deep the mob had buried itself into normal life. In New York, the families controlled the concrete that went into the city's buildings. They took a cut of every big construction job, a private tax on the very business of building the city. Skyscrapers, apartments, all of it quietly fed the mob. This was not some distant, glamorous world. It was a hand in the pocket of everyday business. The trial became known as the Commission case, and it landed like nothing before it. Two of the men charged did not even make it to the end. They passed away during the long trial. On November 19, 1986, the verdict came down on the rest. The bosses were found guilty.
Three family heads, Anthony Salerno, Anthony Corallo, and Carmine Persico, were each sentenced to 100 years in prison. Persico had been so confident that he acted as his own lawyer, and it did not save him. Most of the men convicted in that case grew old and passed away behind bars. The case did two huge things. It proved, in open court, that the commission was real, that this was an organized national operation with a chain of command, not just scattered gangs. And it showed the entire underworld that the government now had a way to remove a whole leadership in one stroke. You did not have to be caught with anything in your hands. You just had to sit at the top of the pyramid. This is the ending The Godfather never gives you. In the films, the family endures. The danger comes from rivals and from within. But the real story of the American mob does not end with a clever boss outsmarting his enemies.
It ends with the heads of the most powerful families sitting side by side in a courtroom, listening to their own recorded voices played back to them, and being sentenced to grow old and die in prison. The empire that felt eternal was taken apart by lawyers, recordings, and a law most people have never even heard of. And notice how unglamorous the whole thing was. There was no dramatic standoff, no grand operatic betrayal. There were tape recordings, accountants, building contracts, and patient prosecutors. The mob was not brought down by a tougher gangster. It was brought down by paperwork and patience, the two least cinematic forces on Earth. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the American families were not the only branch of this world fighting the law. Across the ocean, in the very part of Italy the films treat as the proud, romantic homeland of honor, the mob faced its own wave of brave investigators closing in. And the way they answered was nothing like a man in a bathrobe or a boss going quietly to prison. They chose to take on the state itself, head-on, setting off enormous explosions on public roads to remove the very people trying to bring them to justice. Section 9. The Homeland of Honor took on the state itself. The films treat Sicily as something close to holy ground. It is the old country, the place the family came from, the land of tradition and honor and quiet respect. When Michael Corleone hides there, the island is painted as beautiful and timeless, full of men who live by an ancient code. Even the family's name, Corleone, is borrowed from a real Sicilian town. The whole story leans on the idea that the roots of this world, however dark it later became in America,
were planted in something proud and honorable back home. The truth about the real Sicilian Mafia, especially at its peak, is almost the exact opposite. By the 1980s and early 1990s, the most powerful faction of the Sicilian Mafia came from that very region around Corleone. Their leader was a man named Salvatore Riina, known to many as Toto, and to the underworld as the boss of bosses. He was not a figure of calm, old-world honor. He was the most ruthless mob leader Sicily had ever produced, and under him, the organization treated the Italian state itself as an enemy to be crushed. Standing against him were two men who became heroes to an entire country. Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino were investigators, childhood friends from the same Palermo neighborhood, who gave their lives to pulling the mafia apart through the law. They did not use force. They used evidence, patience, and the testimony of insiders who had turned.
Much of their case was built on the words of one such insider, Tommaso Buscetta, the very kind of turncoat the mafia swore could never exist, who finally explained how the secret world truly worked. Together, they built the biggest case against the Sicilian Mafia in history. It was called the Maxi Trial, and the numbers alone show how serious it was. Falcone and Borsellino managed to put 475 members of the Mafia on trial at the same time, inside a specially built, bunker-like courtroom. It ended with hundreds of convictions, including life sentences for the top bosses. For an organization that had spent a century convincing Sicily it was too powerful to ever be touched, this was a disaster. And when the final appeals failed in early 1992, and those convictions were locked in for good, Riina turned to revenge. The revenge he chose tells you everything about what the real mafia was, underneath the romance. On May 23, 1992, Falcone was driving home from the airport along a highway near a town called Capaci. The mafia had packed a massive charge of explosives into a drainage pipe running beneath the road. As Falcone's convoy passed over it, they set it off. The explosion was so violent, it tore the highway open. Falcone lost his life. So did his wife, Francesca, who was a magistrate herself. So did 3 of the police officers protecting them. Riina, according to those around him, celebrated the news with champagne. Less than 2 months later, the mafia struck again. On July 19, 1992, Paolo Borsellino went to visit his mother in Palermo. As he reached her building, a car packed with explosives was set off in the street. Borsellino was taken from the world, along with 5 police officers guarding him. One of them was a young woman, among the first female officers in Italy to lose her life in such an attack. In the span of just 57 days, the Sicilian Mafia had removed the 2 most important anti-mafia investigators in the entire country. Stop and picture what this actually was. These were not quiet hits in back rooms between rival criminals. The Mafia set off explosions large enough to rip apart public highways, in broad daylight, in places where ordinary people drove and walked every day. They targeted judges, their families, and the police sworn to protect them. This was not the behavior of a secret society quietly guarding its honor. This was an all-out campaign against an entire country, carried out with charges powerful enough to be felt for miles. Now hold that against the gentle, romantic Sicily of the films. The Godfather borrows the name of a real town, Corleone, and wraps it in old-world dignity. In reality, that same region produced the most merciless mafia leadership the island ever knew. The men who answered the law not with clever silence, but with explosions in the street. The proud homeland of honor was, in truth, the launching point for some of the most shocking attacks in modern Italian history. And here is the part the bosses never saw coming. The attacks were meant to frighten Italy into backing down. They did the opposite. The whole country recoiled in horror and grief. Falcone and Borsellino became national heroes, their faces painted on walls, and remembered every single year. The outrage fueled a massive crackdown. Rina himself was captured the very next year and spent the rest of his life behind bars, passing away in prison decades later. The Mafia had tried to break the state, and instead, it handed the state the will to fight back harder than ever before. So the real Mafia was willing to go after the courts, the police, and the government itself. But surely, you might tell yourself, there was still one final line they would not cross.
The films cling to it above all others, the belief that family is sacred, that whatever else these men did, they would never harm a woman or a child. It is the gentlest myth they have left. And the most heartbreaking case in this whole story exists for one reason only: to prove that this line, exactly like every other, was never real at all. Section 10. The last line, and the proof it never existed. Of everything the films ask you to believe, this is the one they hold on to most tightly. Whatever else these men do, the story insists they protect the innocent. Family is sacred. You do not touch women. You especially do not touch children. It is the final shred of honor the movies hand their characters, the thing that lets you watch a man order terrible deeds and still feel that he has a soul somewhere inside. It is a comforting idea. It is also a lie, and the case that proves it is the hardest story in all of this to sit with. In Sicily in the early 1990s, a Mafia member named Santino Di Matteo made the same choice we have watched others make. He turned. He began telling investigators what he knew, including details about the attack that had taken the life of the hero investigator Giovanni Falcone. To the Mafia, this made him the lowest kind of traitor, and they decided the way to punish him was not to come after him at all. It was to come after his child. Santino had a son named Giuseppe, who was about 12 years old. One day, men working for the Mafia came for the boy. They dressed themselves as police officers and told Giuseppe a gentle lie, that they were taking him to go and see his father. He went with them, because why would a child not trust a friendly officer offering to bring him to his dad? That was the last day Giuseppe ever lived as a free child. What followed is almost unbearable to describe. The Mafia held Giuseppe captive for 779 days. More than 2 years. He was kept hidden away, at times in a cage, underfed, and treated with a cruelty no child should ever know. And the whole time, his captors kept sending his father reminders of what they were doing, using the boy as a tool to pressure Santino into taking back his testimony. They were not holding the child to keep him safe. They were holding him as a threat, slowly, for years on end. Santino was caught in an impossible place. His honest testimony was already on the record and could not simply be wiped away, and the Mafia would not release his son. The man ultimately responsible for the boy was a leader named Giovanni Brusca, the same man who had set off the enormous explosion that took Falcone. After 779 days, with the boy no longer useful as leverage, Brusca gave the order to end his life. The words he reportedly used were cold and dismissive, the child spoken of like an animal to be thrown away. Giuseppe was about 14 years old by then, worn down to almost nothing by his long captivity. And then they did the cruelest thing of all. They made certain the boy would never be found. His remains were destroyed completely, so that there would be nothing left to bury, nothing for his family to ever hold. A child who had been alive and trusting 2 years earlier was simply erased from the earth, as if the Mafia believed it could undo the fact that he had ever existed. To this day, investigators describe what was done to Giuseppe as one of the most monstrous crimes in the entire history of the Sicilian Mafia. The man behind it, Brusca, was eventually caught. Over time, he admitted to a role in more than 100 lives taken. When he spoke about the things he had done, he showed almost nothing. No real guilt.
No sign that he grasped the weight of any of it. Years later, he was released from prison after serving his sentence as a cooperating witness, and the news set off an uproar across Italy. Many people simply could not accept that a man tied to a crime like this would ever walk free again. Now, set this beside the warm, sacred family the films sell you. The Godfather wants you to believe that even in the darkest corner of this world, there is a line drawn around the innocent that no real man of honor would ever cross. The protection of women and children is the soul the story gives these characters, the proof that they are still human under everything else they do. Giuseppe Di Matteo is the answer to that fantasy. To silence one informant, the real Mafia took a child, held him for over 2 years, treated him with unthinkable cruelty, ended his life, and made sure his family could never even lay him to rest. There was no sacred line. There was only what was useful, and a child became useful as a threat. This is the case the films could never show, because it does not simply bend the myth, it breaks it completely. You cannot hear this story and still believe these men lived by a code that placed family above all. The code was always for show. It was a way of feeling honorable while doing whatever the moment happened to require. And when the moment required harming a child to protect the organization, the so-called code vanished as if it had never been there, because in truth, it never had been. So now we have 10 true stories, stretching across decades and across 2 countries, from frightened soldiers all the way up to the boss of bosses. Put them all together and a single picture forms, and it looks nothing like the one painted on the screen. The real question left is not whether the films got it wrong, because they clearly did, on purpose, in nearly every way that matters. The real question is why we keep falling in love with a version that was never true, and what it quietly costs us to turn men like these into heroes. That is what we need to face before we finish. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.